You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, recording from Washington, D.C., and I'm delighted to be joined today by the Diplomats managing editor and resident Central Asia and Afghanistan expert, Katie Putz. Katie, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Ankit.
Always a pleasure to have you on the show. And as our listeners can probably guess, we are a little bit overdue to revisit Afghanistan. It's been an interesting year. We've talked about, of course, the Biden administration's decision to finally exit the country after more than 20 years of war. But Katie, I was hoping today that we could talk a little bit about the situation on the ground. Obviously, there's a lot of anxiety here in Washington and elsewhere, certainly in the region as well, about the fate of Afghanistan, so to speak, and the ability of the Taliban to put up a fight that can contest the Afghan government's control of not only much of the country's territory, but especially provincial capitals, which are sort of seen as the main threshold to the fight for the country's future, so to speak. And of course, as the U.S. Withdraws capabilities, the Afghan national security forces are, of course, under considerable strain. So I figured the best place to kind of begin the conversation today, obviously, this week we've seen an outbreak of violence in places ranging from Herat, Lashkar Gah has been under a particular siege, with the Taliban having taken several parts of the country around Lashkar Gah. Some concern about Kandahar as well, although the Afghan security forces seem to be positioned better there. What's your sense of the situation on the ground right now from where you're sitting? How concerned should we be about, potential turn in the tide of the battle there?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's really important to watch the provincial capitals to date. Or as I'm speaking now, the Taliban has not been able to take any provincial capital. They've all remained in government hands. As you mentioned, some of them have been under a lot of pressure, particularly this week. Herat City, the capital of Herat province, and then also Lashkar Gah, which is the center of Helmand province. Those have been under considerable strain, but over the last couple of months, there has been a very clear push by the Taliban into areas that had previously been. Everybody has seen the various color-coded maps, which they are useful in one sense, but they do just show territory, and a lot of that territory is rural territory. There's not a lot of people in some of those places, and so as the Taliban has taken areas that had previously been considered contested, the number of districts under Taliban control has exploded. Of Afghanistan's like 420 something districts, the Taliban, depending on whose map and what time of day you're asking the question, the Taliban control about 200 of them. Now, that seems, I think, a lot worse than the situation may actually be, though the situation is bad. And I think sort of my desire, I would love to see a control map that was done per capita, kind of like they do electoral maps occasionally in the US, and they do it per capita, because otherwise you see sort of the electoral map and it's all red in the middle and you're like, oh gosh, the entire country is red. When you look at the population, the picture shifts. And I think that would be a valuable additional asset, because it's, some like 10-12% of the Afghan population lives in Kabul. Another 10% live in Herat. So these district centers, well, not the district centers, these provincial centers are really important to that fight. And so with the Taliban push into those areas, there's been a lot of anxiety. But I think that's also inspired Afghans to kind of push back. In a sense that, they know what's at stake. Nobody needs to tell them what's at stake. And so these places where there's large concentrations of people, there's definitely a lot of, there's a possibility for some solidarity there that could be politically useful.
Yeah. So, I want to sort of pick your brain on the Central Asia component of this. I mean, especially to the north, where one of the major changes we've seen, just a few years ago, the Afghan government had pretty good control of Badakhshan, the Wakhan corridor, the border with Tajikistan, and events in recent weeks and months have put that into doubt, with a lot of fighting in that region. Badakhshan sort of temporarily, I think, falling very much into Taliban control. The Taliban trying to sort of set up what many would consider one of the components of sovereignty, which is controlling border exchanges and commerce across that border. Can you tell us a little bit about your sense of what's happening at the Tajik-Afghan border right now?
Yeah, so the Tajik-Afghan border is sort of the has been in the news lately. In July, there had been the Taliban pushed into these districts in along the border, took a number of them. According to a BBC map that I'm looking at that's dated from July 26th, the Taliban controlled two border crossings with Tajikistan. And so that's significant for the sort of central Afghan government because border crossings are also where you draw in import revenue. And so if the Taliban is getting the money, then the Afghan government's not. So that's one issue. It also, it's both tactically and symbolically a blow to lose things like border crossings. Now, on the Tajik side, there were estimates vary, but around 2,000 Afghan security forces and various civilians fled across the border when the Taliban was pushing through. They were repatriated to Afghanistan by the Tajiks, who then called up, I think, 20,000 reservists to reinforce the border services. This week, the Russians are running military exercises both in Uzbekistan at the beginning of this week, and then Uzbekistan, Russia, and Tajikistan will be doing exercises near the Afghan border starting today, actually. And so there's definitely some anxiety on the Tajik side. So the Tajik government never really dealt with the Taliban in the way that the Uzbek government and the Turkmen government have invited Taliban delegations, have hosted Taliban delegations in recent times. Tajikistan has done none of that. And so there's definitely some anxiety in Tajikistan about that. On the other hand, the Taliban has, and you can take them for their word or not, and we can all argue about that, has said that they're not interested in invading Tajikistan or really messing with Tajikistan. We have not seen the Taliban cross the border, for example, in any significant fashion. So the Taliban remains focused on gaining control of Afghanistan and doesn't seem to have international ambitions.
Yeah, so one of the things on the U.S. side, so yesterday at the Aspen Security Forum, Zalmay Khalilzad, the U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan under Biden and Trump, was talking about how the expectation is still that the Taliban would focus somehow on a political settlement. I mean, I can guess what your answer is going to be, but I mean, how realistic is any real aspiration for this to de-escalate and head in the direction of any kind of political settlement at this point?
I mean, it seems highly unlikely. You cannot really. You just have to look at the facts. The Taliban is busy fighting, and they are sending delegations, and we can talk about sort of the places the Taliban has visited to talk to people, but they haven't spent that much time in Doha talking to the Afghan government. So that would be kind of the center. One of the things that I wrote this week, because I was looking at sort of this idea that there's a unified international position, that there's going to be a negotiated solution to the Afghan conflict. The international community is not necessarily united on what that's going to look like. China and Russia, I think, would accept a different conclusion than the United States and Europe want. And so, yes, everybody says we want a negotiated solution, but Russia's interest in this, for example, is the security of Central Asia. So their negotiated solution might be with the Taliban. And the same thing with China. Now, that looks really poorly on sort of Russia relations with the Afghan government as it is. But it's I think they're hedging a bit on this. The Taliban is busy trying to take provincial capitals. They're not hashing out an agreement with the Afghan government. I mean, I don't even think they have a shared agenda. The last breakthrough for the intra-Afghan talks was in like December 2020, when they decided on the rules and regulations, or the rules and the procedures for the talks, and that was considered a breakthrough. And they were supposed to move on to doing an agenda, and that's just a non-starter because the Afghan government and the international community want there to be a ceasefire first.
Absolutely.
The Taliban is, clearly not interested.
Yeah, yeah, and you mentioned the thing I wanted to talk about next, which is the Taliban's international contacts. China, India, Russia. It's been interesting to sort of see how every country is really hedging their bets with the
Mm-hmm.
tremendous uncertainty ahead with what might happen in Afghanistan. You sort of do get the feeling that for many of these countries on Afghanistan's periphery, and particularly the major powers, it's sort of there's a sense of inevitability. It's
Mm-hmm.
it's more a question of when, not if, the Afghan government will eventually begin to lose control. So we don't have to go too far into this issue, but I mean, what are some of the concerns here? I mean, if you're China, Russia, I mean, you talked about the Russian core interest, which is the security of Central Asia. For China, it seems to be making sure that the Taliban doesn't allow Afghan soil to be used by, potential extremist groups to carry out sort of terrorist attacks in Western China, for
Mm-hmm.
instance. India has its own sets of concerns relating to regional terrorism and Pakistani influence. Is this something that we should expect to kind of stick around in the near term, that the Taliban will really become a much more common feature on the diplomatic calendar in many of these capitals around the region?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a difficult question to answer because, you know, at what point would we consider the Afghan government that's currently in control in Kabul as not being in control
Hmm.
when they lose some of the provincial capitals, none of the provincial capitals, all like at what point, does the control map have to shrink enough that you then have to kind of consider maybe the Taliban is running the country? And I don't think that point is as close as some other people think that point is. And we can talk about that or not if we want. But I,
Hmm.
I think from the perspective of regional powers, so Russia and China, countries that are a bit closer to Afghanistan, they are trying to make the connections with the Taliban if and when they need them. And if the Taliban, the various different sort of future scenarios, say there is a negotiated settlement between the Kabul and the Taliban becomes a quote unquote normal political party in Afghanistan and participates in the process. I don't think this is the likely future, but just
Hmm.
just for the heck of it, then they would still be something that these external countries have to deal with at some point, in the same
Yeah.
way that international powers maintain political relations with multiple political parties in every country, and try to be very diplomatic, because you never know who's going to be in charge in 10 years. And so I think that's part of that hedging. It is also possible they are trying, well, it's not possible. It is true. They are trying to nudge them back to talking because that's this quickest solution to everybody getting what they want out of this, which is predictable stability. And most of these countries also have an economic interest
Right.
that would be better served by stability and peace than it is by war. But, you
Yeah.
know,
And the Taliban have been, pretty attuned to those economic interests. I mean, they've sort of sent signals to China and India that, as long as those countries don't actively give military support to Kabul,
mm-hmm.
they're happy to hold off on attacking, economic projects or investments that are underway in the country. So they're sort of playing the cards that they've been dealt, as well as possible to try and deter these countries. But it's hard for me to imagine. I mean, especially it's still kind of fuzzy the kind of contacts the Indians in particular are having with the Taliban at this point. But India's interest in Afghanistan, I think the overarching interest is to ensure that Afghanistan doesn't turn into a return to its status as part of sort of Pakistan's sphere of
Mm-hmm.
influence in the region. What's your sense of what the Indians might be thinking longer term here, though?
I mean, I think they have similar interests to the United States in a way that they have economic interests in Afghanistan, and then they have sort of a close but distant security interest. They don't want Afghanistan to be a place where people can go train and then fly over or go through Pakistan and attack India.
Mm-hmm.
That's I think is part of that concern. And so, like everybody else, who whether they've designated the Taliban as a terrorist group, which Russia has, the United States never did, or not, they're still trying to talk to them,
Yeah.
in a sense, because they're whether anybody likes it or not, they are part of the political milieu in Afghanistan, and how that's approached is going to may have ramifications for all of those countries, India included, in the future.
Mm-hmm.
But it's I can't stress enough that it's impossible to kind of predict where this is going to go, and that's it's an unsatisfying piece of analysis, but that's the truth. Is it's unclear.
Yeah. No, I think I think that's right. And I mean, I certainly hesitate to pretend to know where Afghanistan is going to be in a few weeks or months. But I mean, I do share that broader sense of pessimism about the Afghan government's tall task ahead, let's say, in terms of keeping control of the country. I mean, just because if there is really no momentum towards a political settlement, I mean, really this then does turn into protracted, prolonged civil war with districts sort of changing hands. You've talked a lot about these maps that we've been seeing. We can expect to see colors kind of change back and forth. Inevitably, provincial capitals coming under siege and so forth. So it's really a terrible fate for Afghanistan after all of these years of conflict and the U.S. presence in the country. But unfortunately, I think this is where we are today. Before we close, Katie, is there anything else you want to draw attention to when it comes to Afghanistan's status right now?
I guess I would just say that there was sort of I guess, civil society protest this week in a number of Afghan cities in which Afghans went up to their rooftops and shouted Allahu Akbar in support of the Afghan security forces. And while that's not, anything military, I do think we can't lose sight of the fact that there's a lot of Afghans who want a different future. And so it will be interesting to watch if that can motivate the kind of political cohesiveness that is necessary. The Afghan government has always been disunified. It has always sort of struggled with unity and corruption and all of these things. But if the people who do have power and have their own militias and have weapons and money can kind of stay together, then I think they do have a chance. If they can't and they kind of just pick off and sort of decide like, this is, I get this fiefdom, you get that fiefdom, then we're sort of headed to civil war, and that will be yet another tragedy and really a long string of tragedies.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Katie, thanks so much for joining me today and sharing your insights on Afghanistan. Really appreciate it.
Always a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Diplomats Podcast. If you like what you heard, make sure you subscribe so you can keep up with future episodes. And if you've been a subscriber for a while but you haven't yet left us a review, please do so. We really do appreciate that. You can leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, TuneIn, wherever you get your show. Thanks a lot for listening, and I'll be back soon with more.